Revolutionary greetings, comrades. It's a red Sunday. It's the 10th of November 2024. In our political education, we are looking into the elections that were held in Mozambique, briefly in Botswana, and of course the United States of America. We are sure that some of you have not yet gone to church. So before you go to your Bible study, you might want to be with us for now in our political education. Umhavulo sike sixoxeni ngepolitics lingayi ezinkonzweni sikhangele ukuthi kuhambe njani kuhamba njani eMozambique lokuthi kwenzakaleni eBotswana. Donald Trump is back at the White House. He has been elected the 47th president of the United States of America. We hope that his presidency will bring an end to the imperialist war that is ongoing in Eastern Europe. We know his relationship with President Vladimir Putin. We hope that they are going to resolve that war in Ukraine. There are questions, of course, about the attitude of the Americans to a woman president. Is something that I saw my brother Rejoice Ngwenya writing about why America is not electing a female president in the United States, something that we have not done in Zimbabwe, something that has not been done here in South Africa. Mr. Rejoice Ngwenya gave examples in his article that he posted today on Facebook about countries in Europe that have had females as head of government or head of states, something that the United States is not has not yet achieved. But of course, we look into these elections trying to draw lessons as Zimbabweans. What do these elections mean? Our focus is in Botswana and in Mozambique. What we have in these two SADC member states is that one former liberation movement is accused of rigging elections. The Mozambique and South Africa border was closed because Frelimo, a former liberation movement, is accused of rigging elections. While in Botswana, one former liberation movement has come to power in Botswana after it established a coalition with other political formations in Botswana and formed Umbrella for Democratic Change. That is Botswana National Front. It's a liberation movement. So you have a liberation movement that has been in power since independence in Mozambique, that today stands accused of rigging elections. What does this mean? So there are lessons to be drawn, because what is clear in Mozambique is that there is a gap between Frelimo and the majority of Mozambicans, particularly in urban centers, the working class. Corruption is the order of the day, like most liberation movements in Africa. What does this mean? It as Zimbabwe, because ZANU-PF is corrupt. I'm reading a book by former Zimbabwean Prime Minister Adam Dambara, where in his book, it's about thought leadership, where in his book he speaks about what happened in 2008 in Zimbabwe. He says the late former Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai won elections in Zimbabwe by 73%. So in his book, Professor Arthur Mdambara said, General Chiwenga was invited to State House in 2008 after the March elections by the late President Robert Mugabe, and Mugabe had said was going to respect the will of the people, was ready to concede defeat. But according to Arthur Mdambara, Mugabe was told to stay put, and we all know what then happened. So in Zimbabwe, we have a liberation movement that refused to accept results, to accept what the people had said. Frelimo today stands accused of rigging elections. As I said in a previous video, that some of us were disappointed because of this gap between the liberation movement and the people of Mozambique, to an extent that a right-wing formation like Renamo is then preferred as the savior of the people of Mozambique. We know the history of Renamo since the Civil War, being sponsored by apartheid South Africa, United States of America, and the other imperialist forces. But because of the attitude of the ruling party, corruption in the main, has led people to see a reactionary movement as their savior. That is the problem that we have with the liberation movement. In Botswana, a former liberation movement has taken over power, led by President Boko. Botswana National Front was established on the 10th of October 1965. It participated in the first elections in 1969. Or it took part in elections in 1969, and it has been the opposition party ever since 1969 in Parliament until now, when then in 2012 it went into a coalition with other opposition parties, establishing and leading Umbrella for Democratic Change, UDC, which has now won elections. Because the Botswana Democratic Party, which has been leading Botswana since independence, it was not a progressive liberation movement. It never played the role that UNIPO played. When Botswana gained independence, the Botswana Democratic Party did not allow other liberation movements to set up base. It was UNIP in Zambia that housed ZAPU, SWAPO, ANC, and other liberation movements, including ZANU. But the Botswana Democratic Party never did. And some of you will recall that I think it was in 2012 when Comrade Julius Malema was the president of the ANC Youth League, which was part of why he was fired from the ANC, because he publicly criticized the Botswana Democratic Party. He said, then, I quote, "A footstool of imperialism, a security threat to Africa, and always under constant puppetry of the United States," close quote. This is what Comrade Malema said in 2012 about the Botswana Democratic Party, which now has lost the elections. So I see that some comrades think that UDC is a party that emerged in 2012 is a new party. No. Botswana National Front, BNF, was founded on the 10th of October 1965. What does this teach us? What are the lessons for us in Zimbabwe? The simple lesson is that in a revolution, there are no quick solutions. There's nothing called instant revolution. Coffee, I'm sure you put coffee manje. Try instant coffee. There's no instant revolution. It takes dedication. It takes dedication, self-sacrifice to win power. This thing, you establish a political party, the next day or after one election, you then split. Think of the movement for democratic change. That was established in 1999. It is no longer there. It is no longer there, the MDC. After the 2005 elections, it split into two factions. After the 2013 elections, it split again, MDC team. Then towards the 2018 MDC alliance was put together. It couldn't stand. We saw the recalls, Triple C members and so forth. Yes, of course, the Botswana National Front had its share of problems, particularly in 1998. In 1994, the Botswana National Front, BNF, which is the leader of the UDC, it had won 37.1% of the vote. But of course, it then had problems. Some members of parliament left to establish Botswana Congress Party. But the comrades in the Botswana National Front stayed together. They to build the party. I attended I think it was around 2017 or 2016, 2017, their congress in Francistown of the Botswana National Front. And the comrades had established UDC for the purposes of uniting the opposition. So in Zimbabwe, we have Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, a liberation movement, an authentic liberation movement. And the lessons, particularly for us, and as ZAPU, I'm not a member of ZAPU. I come from the tradition of the liberation movement, but I'm not a member of ZAPU. But the lessons for ZAPU as a liberation movement is that there are no quick victories. And it is critical that ZAPU as a former liberation movement must be the alternative in Zimbabwe. Because in Botswana, the liberation movement, Botswana National Front, entered into a coalition with other opposition parties to dislodge a reactionary liberation movement known as Botswana Democratic Party, which has been in government since independence in Botswana. So ZAPU as a former liberation movement, and I think comrades should take this seriously, that ZAPU as a former liberation movement must be built as an alternative to the reactionary ZANU, because ZANU was founded as a reactionary movement. And the reason why ZANU is still in power today is because the opposition is seen as stooges of imperialist forces, anti-African. That's the view. So if you have ZAPU as an authentic liberation movement, that must take its place, and the ZAPU must not be persuaded, as some comrades would want to do. Be persuaded, and the ZAPU then becomes a Matabeleland party. Because the ZAPU was founded as a liberation movement, an authentic liberation movement in 1978. In its ideological book, in its ideology, in 1978, it adopted Marxism-Leninist as a guiding ideology. So ZAPU cannot afford, and I'm saying this with so much humility, ZAPU must fight and resist the temptation of it becoming a regional political party. It should not allow itself, because ZAPU must learn from the Botswana National Front. And I was happy to see the Secretary General of ZAPU, Comrade Hanana, attending the inauguration of the new Botswana president. And the lessons for ZAPU and all of us is not that the opposition, which has no history in the strife of our liberation, has taken power. No. It is a former liberation movement. It is ZAPU. They always say ZAPU is the mother party. If you talk to comrades in ZAPU, they will say, no, we are the mother party. As a mother party, it must therefore unite the opposition. Because we want to complete the liberation of Zimbabwe. And completing the liberation of Zimbabwe, you need a formal liberation movement to lead that process of completing the liberation of Zimbabwe. And the ZAPU fits the bill. As long as it resists the temptation of it becoming a Matabeleland party. Ukuthi hayi ZAPU iphathi yamaNdebele akusebenzi, iZAPU asophathi yamaNdebele. iZAPU yiphathi yeZimbabwe eyafonywa as a liberation movement for all Zimbabweans, and the ZAPU must draw lessons from Botswana National Front. The Botswana National Front entered into a coalition, I think it was 2012, I can't remember the year, but entered into a coalition with other opposition parties to establish umbrella for democratic change. Yiko isiwinile, because it had to adapt to the new reality in Botswana. Ukuthi you needed to bring opposition parties and as a liberation movement lead. And this is what ZAPU must learn. Botswana National Front, founded in 10th October 1965. It has been there. It is not a new movement. So as we seek to complete our own liberation in Zimbabwe, ZAPU must stand up and lead, draw lessons from Botswana. We have an obligation, all of us, if we are to complete the liberation of Zimbabwe, to assist the ZAPU to resist the temptation of becoming a regional party. We have a responsibility to assist the ZAPU to stay on as a Marxist-Leninist organization, as a leader among Zimbabweans, and dislodge ZANU-PF, because ZANU-PF cannot stand up, Mnangagwa cannot stand up and say ZAPU is led or is being sponsored by imperialist forces, as they will do to the MDC, as they will do to CCC, as they will do to the new movement that we are told is on the cards to be launched. They can't stand and say ZAPU is a product of imperialist forces. In any case, it is ZANU which is a product of imperialistic forces. So ZAPU must challenge ZANU PF. And the challenging ZANU PF, first and foremost, as I move to conclusion, is that ZAPU must establish structures countrywide in Zimbabwe. I've seen, I know the comrades in ZAPU, but that's what must happen. I've seen the temptation. Ukuthi hayi izaphu nyangapha emathebeleleni. There's this temptation, and this temptation must be resisted. The second thing that ZAPU must do, ZAPU must get into working with the trade unions, because as a political party there must be a base, and the base of ZAPU must be the working class and the peasantry countrywide in Zimbabwe, if we are to complete our liberation. Anti lonke vele khona phela inlandelayo lalingabe ZAPU. I'm not recruiting anyone to ZAPU, but I mean, I'm simply drawing lessons from Mozambique, that in Mozambique the liberation movement has betrayed the ideals of the liberation struggle. Hence today it stands accused of rigging elections. And the people of Mozambique are now seeing a right-wing reactionary movement, a party founded by apartheid South Africa and the United States of America, Britain and others, as their savior. And the blame is at the doorstep of Frelimo as a liberation movement, because it has not built an economy that benefits the majority of the people of Mozambique. It has betrayed the ideals of the liberation struggle. But what inspires us is that while in Mozambique, the path of liberation is losing in Mozambique. There's been a recount of the elections, is accused of rigging, is losing. But what inspires us is that in Botswana, a liberation movement has taken power. It has been in the opposition ranks since it is participated in the elections in 1969. And its best performance was in 1964. I mean, it was in 1994, winning 37.1% of the vote. And unfortunately, in 1998, some comrades in the Botswana National Front left and established the Botswana Congress Party. But the comrades had to rebuild Botswana National Front, entered into a coalition, established the UDC, which now is in power in Botswana. So that's a lesson for us, that we must have a part of liberation in Zimbabwe if we are to dislodge a liberation movement. Because if you go to Sudan, they will tell you about ZAPU. If you go to Algeria, they will tell you about ZAPU. In fact, it was a zebra that lent Toy from Algeria, and the zebra passed the Toy to MK, Mkhonto Wesizwe, the military wing of the ANC. And the MK then, yasi lokuza try wenzani, it then fine-tuned Toy, as we now know familiar with for those of us that live in South Africa. Comrade Pilani Pitsompov, ZAPU is not finished. I want to disagree. It is not finished. The problem with the ZAPU is that comrades forget that it is a former liberation movement. Like I'm saying, that it is our duty, it is our task, all of us, to rebuild ZAPU as a former liberation movement, for it to adapt to the current realities in Zimbabwe. That in Zimbabwe, we must dismantle ZANUism. And dismantling ZANUism means we must defeat ZANU PF. We must remove ZANU PF from power. And for the last 24 years, the opposition, which has constantly won elections and rigged, with the support of Africa as a whole in rigging the elections is that the opposition are stooges of imperialist forces. But no one can stand up and say ZAPU was established as a stooge of imperialist forces. I see my friend, journalist from Harare, Comrade Mlondolozi Ndlovu is here. I would like to hear your views, Comrade Mlondolozi Ndlovu, and all of you, please write in the comment section, like this video. Also follow us on TikTok. We're also on TikTok. Otherwise, nyawazi abanye seligijimele ema-church. Amandla, comrades.